Good evening. My name is Mark Harris. This is DiversiTV. If you're just tuning in for the first time, welcome. If you're returning, welcome back. Tonight we'll be talking about, my guest and I will be talking about the state of African Americans in Eugene and illuminating that as a diversity issue. But first, let me cut to DiversiTV mission. If you haven't ever seen that, it's to illuminate everyday diversity issues and give the mic and the camera to those who don't always get it. To that end, our schedule based on our first two seasons, we generally start off with a Native perspective only because we're on native ground, and it's always good to remind us of that. Last week we did the Anglo perspective. Today we're dealing with African Americans in Eugene. Next week we'll be dealing with Latino perspective. February 13th, the Asian perspective. February 20th, the gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer questioning, and two-spirit perspective. February 27th, we'll be dealing with disability issues. March 5th, youth, and March 12th, class. And ending this season, we'll be talking about spirituality and religion, maybe reprising a Native American perspective, maybe not, we'll see. Tonight's guest is Greg Evans. Let's see. Who is the Director of African American Programs here at Lane Community College. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you.
What do you do as Director of African American Programs?
Well, Mark, I've been here about 13 years now, and my role has grown over that 13 years. When I originally came here as Special Projects Coordinator, my title has over the years morphed into different things, and so I do several things. I am Director of the Rites of Passage programs here at LCC for youth of color.
Director and founder, one might add.
Director and founder for youth of color in middle school and high schools here in the Lane County area. I also teach courses out of the Counseling and Ethnic Studies Department. So my most recent course that I've taught is the Black Leadership course, History, Theory, and Practice. In the near future, I'm developing courses on, one, the N-word, and we're going to have a real frank discussion about the history, uses, and the perspective of the N-word as it impacts our culture, not only today, but from a historical context. And then I'm also going to be teaching a class on the history of hip-hop and hip-hop today, and asking and posing the question, does hip-hop matter? And what hip-hop's integration is into the overall general pop culture of American society, thus the continuing infusion of African-American culture, perspectives, paradigms, values into our American diaspora, American culture that we have here today.
So your position has evolved, because what was a special project? I mean, that is a rubric that can kind of cover lots of different sins, shall we say.
Well, let's say that originally that I was brought on in a couple of different contexts. One is to address some of the political issues that were brewing at the time in the mid-90s that were facing not only the college but other institutions here in Eugene and throughout Lane County about the questions of race and the involvement of African Americans and other minorities in our institutions, and addressing the issues of institutional racism and how that played out, and what were the reasons for us not having the number of African Americans on staff in the areas of faculty as well as classified and management that should be reflected in our institutions for us to be successful in educating our students. So I was brought in at a time when There weren't a lot of black faces on campus. You, Bill Powell, and the list gets even shorter after that of those folks who were here at Lane at the time. I think I became the third faculty member who was African American here on the campus. And part of my responsibility was to connect with and relate to African American students, and also to try to help build capacity for the institution in terms of not only serving African American students, but serving all students with a perspective that came from a different lens, if you will, from an African American lens that would help prepare all students for a marketplace, a workplace that was becoming increasingly diverse. And a lot of our students at that time, as we continue to this day, are not prepared for a diverse workforce and a diverse economy.
In the interest of full disclosure, we should say that you and I are transplants to the state of Oregon and also to Eugene. That's one piece.
Yes.
Two,
most African Americans here are transplants.
Most African Americans are transplants. And specifically in terms of the role that you just described, at the time that, let's see, if you've been here, been in Lane for 13 years and I've been here for 16 years, you were in fact the third faculty member, not the third historical faculty member at Lane Community College, but starting in the early to mid 90s, there were just three of us at the time. There were at the time you got hired, I believe there were basically 5 African Americans on campus at its peak. And I guess in the interest of full disclosure, we should talk about our secret underground organization BASE, which was started for the first time in Lane Community College's history when there were actually 12 African Americans on campus for the first time.
Yes.
In 98. And we are founding members of that. And yeah, there were 12 African Americans, both classified faculty and management, and now there are 6 of us, I believe, at last count. So one of the things that we had looked at in terms of looking at our Constitution, our presentation to the Board of Education at the time, was saying, look, we're not an anomaly. Usually when African Americans are in largely white institutions, you know, we form organizations like this, and we usually do things like rites of passage, you know, where we organize those kind of activities, and then also as a matter of course, are generally inclusive. And you know, when you founded Rites of Passage, the intent was actually to have not only all groups of color, but also eventually, I mean, we could talk about in terms of that specific enterprise, Rites of Passage, what would a white Rites of Passage look like? We've been asked continually, you know, well, what about gay and lesbian youth? Well, okay, y'all figure that out yourselves and bring us the curriculum. We'll be happy to include that at some point. But you know, the question always gets asked, well, why a program like Rites of Passage?
Well, there's several perspectives here. One is that we are in the Pacific Northwest generally, but specifically we're in the state of Oregon. And history kind of dictates to us that African Americans have been excluded from the state of Oregon, the territory of Oregon, by custom and by law.
Yes.
And because of that, we have an extreme minority of numbers throughout the state. The largest population of African Americans residing in the Portland metro area.
Yeah.
That is relatively small. The state is comprised of about 1% African Americans, and in Lane County, we make up 0.7% of the population.
0.7.
0.7.
Not even a percentage point.
Not even a percentage point out of 338,000 people in Lane County. So, and you can see that a large number of those African Americans are first generation mixed race. So they're either a product of interracial marriages between African Americans and Anglo-Saxon or white Americans or Euro-Americans or other minority groups that are here in the community. So because of that, we saw a void, if you will, in terms of the education and maturation process of African American children or mixed race children in this community. And that void was the lack of a cultural framework from an Afrocentric perspective that lended itself to beginning to give those African American children a strong sense of self, a positive self-image, and a realistic perspective of what the African American community was about, what African American history was about in this country, and a further extension, what is the history of African peoples around the globe. So what we needed to do was to give these young people a sense of who they are and where they come from. And those images were not being formed on MTV, not being conveyed to them from the streets, not being formed by a negative image that was imposed upon them by their peers or by adults in the community that devalued the African American contribution to our society and the African American presence in the community.
So when you say, for example, Afrocentric, you're not, correct me if I'm wrong, but since we've worked together a lot, I'm basically just having our conversations background. We're not talking about ethnocentric.
No.
We're talking about a way of forming a reality that deals with, one, the reality of the construct of race and the fact that when you talk about quote-unquote so-called mixed-race people, we're not just talking about an African-American context, but we might be talking about, from a curriculum point of view, talking about Alexander Dumas, who wrote not only The Three Musketeers, but extensively wrote about race in France, what it was like to be the son of a black general in Napoleon's army and a white woman and living in France in his time. So most of the people, one, don't even know that Dumas was Afro-European, as it were, and that he also wrote about race. And so the issues that we talk about in terms of quote-unquote mixed-race folks in America is nothing new to Western civilization, and that there is a pattern for being within this particular cultural context that means, one, you have to have an awareness of history, two, you have to be politically aware, and three, you might have to deal with systemic discrimination on a daily basis, almost from the cradle, certainly as a young child, and certainly dealing with it with increasing competence, and that has to be part of your upbringing. And sadly, it is not. And that's one of the things that a rites of passage program attempts to correct.
Well, yeah, and see, what happens and what has happened over the years with students who have come to our program is that they've learned about Dumas. They've learned about Alexander Pushkin. They have learned about the various heroes and heroines of African American history. Our students, have come in and said they did not know who Langston Hughes was, for example. They had not been exposed in the school district or school systems to an Alice Walker, although they are teaching Alice Walker now. They had not been exposed to a Ralph Ellison. They had not been exposed to those literary heroes. They didn't know who came before Denzel Washington,
right,
okay?
Right.
Or Sidney Poitier, right, who they may have a vague
if
notion
they even
of that.
know who that is. Right.
We have students who don't know who Jackie Robinson was. We have students who don't know who Frederick Douglass was, and on and on and on. And because of that lack of knowledge, that lack of history, it emphasizes the void that our students have, that our African American and mixed race children, and also all children, regardless of color, have about the American experience and the worldwide experience and the contributions that Africans and African peoples has made to society. not only Western civilization, but all civilization. And I call, we talk about in terms of Western and Eastern thought and philosophy. I like to talk in terms of also Southern philosophy. And when I talk about Southern philosophy, I'm talking about African philosophy. Right. We're talking about the Southern continent, okay? And the Southern continent is the cradle of civilization, both figuratively and literally. And so if we look at this has been examined over the recent years, that man has emanated from Africa, has spread throughout the world, has had changes as a result of the impact of climate on physical features and other parts of human anatomy that have evolved over the centuries, over the millennia, that we see that we all are Africans and we all come from that same basic point of reference as evolved human beings. And so what we need to do is we need to make sure that our students know and understand that background, have a pride in that, and are not gravitating towards a negative image of themselves, a negative image of their community that's promoted by corporations and by other entities in our society for the purpose of making money.
One also could say that it's also cultivated by a serious omission of information in terms of involvement and the history of a place.
And let's call it what it is, Mark. There still exists an overt racial paradigm in this country, as we see right now with the race between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. That race is continually injected into that discussion and dialogue, as we knew that it would be when an African-American male became a serious contender for the United States presidency. And because he is a serious contender, because he has captured white votes in predominantly white states, now the issue of race becomes even more prominent in the campaign. So you can't walk around it with eggshells. It has to be addressed. It is being addressed, and it's not being addressed in the most creative and constructive ways that, model the quote-unquote progress that, our media it keeps articulating us to every day about how we have progressed as a people with regard to race.
Yes. How do you think that plays out locally in terms of local politics?
In terms of local politics, it's kind of a two-edged sword. You can see that over the years, probably I've been here in this community for the past 21 years. And during that time, we have elected an African-American city councilor in Eugene and one in Springfield. We have elected African-Americans to the Eugene School District 4J board. We have an African-American who subsequently was appointed and elected to several terms as a county commissioner. So in terms of electoral politics, there has been a sense of acceptance in terms of African Americans in leadership roles.
Not as mayor.
Not as mayor. I ran for mayor once back in 1992. But I did get a significant share of the vote at that time, 24% of the vote during the primary. So if you really look at also the leadership paradigms within the appointed positions, the administrative positions in the government, right now we have an interim African-American woman as city manager in the city of Eugene. We have had and continue to have an African-American as head of the Eugene 4J school district. We have had African-Americans in other prominent positions in the community, most of which over the years have not been able to stick or stay. And that is because of institutional racism. It has been, the quiet, unspoken pressure to push individuals out because they are different. They are not, as someone, I was on a committee here several years ago in which an African American was part of the finalist interview pool for the Director of Public Safety here at Lane Community College. And the comment that was made in that by one of the more prominent members of this particular committee was that
still currently an employee. I might add.
That individual is retired.
Oh, okay.
But this individual had basically said that he isn't one of us. And
one of us?
One of us. And that individual went on to explain that this African-American man who was eminently qualified did not exhibit the traits or habits that would make him be an ideal fit for the Lane Community College family, quote unquote.
The
family
fit issue.
The fit issue, the family issue.
This person, I assume, was qualified at least to make the interview pool in terms of having a background in law enforcement, meeting minimum qualifications.
This is all correct,
et cetera.
Yes.
Okay.
But see, this is a very parochial, very cliquish community, and if you are not seen as being one of the family, one of the boys, one of the girls here in Eugene, you're either in the clique or you're out of the clique. And so there are definitive insiders in this community and there are definitive outsiders in the community. Most African Americans fit in the outsider category, no matter how long we've been here, okay? So we can have citizenry who has been here since the 40s, has had 2, 3, 4 generations born into this community, and still those individuals are considered to be outsiders within their own community.
Because there are those who may be viewing them that may think that you just made a paranoid statement. But there is the reality and the sense that you're not a real Oregonian if you didn't come in on the wagon trains, that you didn't have 5 or 6 generations, and it must be said in terms of the history of the state. I mean, this was a state that was created to exclude African American citizens of other states of the United States from coming here. So we're not even talking about the slavery issue. We're talking about if you were a citizen, a free citizen in Massachusetts, you could not come to Oregon. You were in fact forbidden.
It was illegal to be black in Oregon.
It was essentially illegal to be black in Oregon, even though there were some blacks in Oregon. So when
Thus the creation of healthy African American communities in places like Centralia, Tacoma, Seattle.
All in Washington.
All in Washington, yes.
All in Washington. So part of, I guess, the plight that we deal with in terms of having numbers artificially limited, so by law and legislation and custom, we could never necessarily fit in, or if we did fit in, that would be in fairly limited ways. So that we could have, for example, just to call it out, black members of the town club, which is now defunct. But the town club was a club in the heart of Eugene, where basically business leaders could come, and we did once have a black president. You know who I'm talking about, right? Mm-hmm. So we know this person, and he was successful in leading an effort to raise money. But would he be considered a mover and shaker? And would he, he doesn't have political aspirations. Would he be accepted as a mayor of Eugene? Probably not, because he's not one of us. And so when you talk about, say, that director of public safety job, or when we talk about some of the experience of former base members who have since moved on to other institutions or are now with the ancestors, a number of their initiatives as managers, as vice presidents, even having a president, we have found that there has been some resistance to their ideas, not because their ideas had no merit, or not that their ideas were untried in other places, but because it was an African American speaking those ideas. And we're not only talking about, we're talking about resistance from all groups, not all just groups, classified. Yeah. We're talking about faculty, PhD from the University of Oregon, white faculty saying, well, I didn't like your idea, Mr. Head of the Mathematics Department, because, you know, it was a black man saying it. I'm sorry to say that I did that, but, you know, that's a quote.
Well, you know, talking with a former colleague of ours prior to our getting here, Richard Turner, who was president of LCC way back when in the late 1980s, who was subsequently forced to leave here. Richard had expressed to me the fact that, you know, various people on this campus and in this campus community viewed him as an Eastern gangster, someone who basically came in without the knowledge or sensitivity to the cultural idiosyncrasies of the Lane way. And so I have yet to find out or define what the Lane way is, but I know real clearly that over the years it's been expressed to me that I don't fit into the Lane way. So I'm not sure if that is as a philosophical construct. However, I do view that as being part and parcel, a function of my identity as an African American.
The Lane way.
The Lane way.
And I guess in the interest of full disclosure, I mean, I have an interim appointment as Chief Diversity Officer. So one of, you know, part of my marching orders is, you know, especially sitting on a couple of hiring committees and having chaired and co-chaired search committees, you know, hearing continual reference to the Lane way. You know, when you spoke of Richard Turner, I mean, one of his innovations in studying him in particular is he brought telephone registration to Lane. Now, at the time, because I remember back in the day not registering at Lane, but registering at my college, we used to go to the gym and have these IBM punch cards, wait in long lines, and get these punch cards for classes and then register that way. And that was the Lane way, handing out those punch cards. So it seemed like the use of moving to telephone registration, where you could not wait at a long line, dial up, and then select your telephone classes, you know, with, you know, voicemail and, you know, interactive menus, would be an innovation. That would seem, oh, well, let's move into the latter part of the 20th century. And that was resisted somewhat, even though we did finally go with that. And then similarly, you know, when we went from telephone registration to now online registration.
Yeah, well, Mark, it's what I call the Lewis Latimer effect. If you know who Lewis Latimer is, Lewis Latimer was the chief assistant to Thomas Edison, also Alexander Graham Bell. He is the man
Both of them.
Yes, he is the man who drew the patents for the light bulb, for the movie camera, for the telephone. He basically was the mechanical engineer that helped facilitate the efficient production of most of Edison's inventions, as well as Alexander Graham Bell. And he was not recognized for his contribution until the end of his life.
Yes.
So, right. You know, it's always couched as, you know, Edison's creation, Bell's creation, without understanding that he had a team of scientists, both of them, all of these creators had teams of scientists working with them, and it also happened to be one of the geniuses, the prominent scientist, was Latimer, who was sought by all white scientists during the late 19th century to do their drawings, their patent work, and to perfect their innovations. So, you know, it's the same thing today. We come up with a good idea. It does not get recognized until we're either too old or too dead to, you know, be lauded for it or be rewarded for it.
But still, I mean, we're able to come up with some innovations, even though, I mean, like rites of passage.
It doesn't stop the creativity.
Right.
What it does is it doesn't recognize the contributions, or it marginalizes the contributions of African Americans. It's almost like, wow, how did he do that? How did she do that? And that wow factor continues to this day. So people are continually amazed by Barack Obama. It's like, wow, you know, or they're amazed by an Angel Jones. My God, she's articulate.
Yes,
she knows
right.
what she's talking about. The wow factor with a Bobby Green. Oh my God, he knows what he's talking about. He's done his homework. He's, you know, up on the issues. So it's always this constant factor of amazement as to, wow, you can actually speak the English language without
a
cursing,
black accent.
without a black accent, without cursing, without, you know, with having a vocabulary that is over 120 words. So, you know, these things are continually wow factors in this community for a lot of people because they get their eyes open. And it's like, you know, I didn't know African Americans could do that. You know, it's like everybody's watching Good Times reruns here. Okay?
Or Yo MTV Raps or something. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. What is up? I guess what is up with like we said earlier in the broadcast, you and I are transplants. So when we're talking about the state of African Americans in Eugene, what's your take on that?
I think that we are a reflection right now of a couple of different phenomena going on in Black America. One is the class divide.
Okay.
There is clearly a class divide in African American society. There are three divisions in African American society today. The first one is characterized by what we call the super rich or the wealthy. I want to say wealthy. We're the rich African Americans in the society because wealth is a different concept than being rich.
Right.
And so you have upper class and upper middle class African Americans who are upwardly mobile by virtue of their career, their status, and their income. And so they have formed a class of their own that is unique and has separated itself from the rest of the body of African American population. Then you have the working / middle class African Americans, which make up the majority of African American society, along with the upper higher class African Americans. And then you have 1/3 of African America that is steeped in continual poverty, generational poverty, that is an unbroken chain or an unbroken line. You find that same dynamic here in Eugene. And so that's one piece of the phenomenon, the class structure. You also have a generational gap between young African Americans and older African Americans. It's hip hop versus soul and R&B. So there's a clear 1976 to 1980 divide, kind of the disco era, if you want to use music as the paradigm here, between the old school Motown African American community and the new school rap and hip hop African American community that is out there. So you have that dynamic going on. And, you know, finally, you now have another dynamic within that dynamic, and that is the dynamic separation in the fact that there has been a systematic breakdown in the African American family. So now that in 1970, most African American households were headed up by a male. And then you had a male, female in the household, mother and father.
The so-called
nuclear
family. Right.
And today, that script has been flipped so that we have anywhere from 75 to 79% of African American households being headed by a female with no male in sight. And that most males, not most males, but a sizable population of African American males are incarcerated, on parole or probation, or unemployed, which is also a huge problem. And all of these macro issues are reflected here in Eugene in macro ways in Eugene. So you have an upper class, a very, very small upper class of Eugenians who are able to, basically do what they want by virtue of their income and their status and their careers. And then you have a small middle class that is surviving and kind of going paycheck to paycheck. And then you have a underclass, if you will, of African Americans here who are barely surviving and are relegated to, almost near poverty status, if not below the poverty line itself. And then you have another dynamic here as well, which you have a local indigenous African American community, which does exist, going back to the 1940s, and I think is what we call the five families of Eugene.
The pioneer families.
The pioneer families of Eugene.
Yeah.
We're not talking about the five families of the mafia. We're talking about the five families of the African American Eugene. And then subsequently, the influx of African Americans in the late 1950s, in the mid-1960s to the university community, as opposed to those transplants who came in the 1980s and beyond. So there's some divisions in terms of people who arrived here in certain time periods and the way that they have been able to interact and intermingle and integrate or not integrate into the overall community of Eugene.
Yes, well, you and I have been referred as newcomers by the
by the old guard.
Yes, by the old guard. When we talk about, so some of those issues that African Americans deal with in Eugene, and I guess one of the things that we talk about with that old guard, because there seems to be, for example, if you could talk about the project that's coming up not only this weekend, but also the project with LTD in terms of historical recognition, where a lot of people, I refer to them as invisible Eugenians. And the reason that they're invisible is that African Americans have been here since the founding of Eugene. But until Wiley Griffin came along, they weren't identified by name. They could be interviewed by the newspaper, for example, in 1865, when Emancipation Proclamation and the end of the Civil War, and blacks were asked, a number of black community members were asked, what their opinion was about emancipation, but the paper didn't name them, didn't quote them, because technically it was illegal for them to be here. So I'm not sure why the newspaper could talk to them but not identify them, because everybody obviously knew they were here. Wiley Griffin, when he was here and when he was alive, doing a very prominent, occupying a very prominent place in the community in terms of visibility, it was illegal for him to be here. But he becomes the first historical African American, and he wasn't the only one.
He was the first public.
He was the first publicly identified African American, but there had to be others. And then we have this strange gap between Wiley Griffin, and then all of a sudden, the pioneers show up in the late 40s, even though there are people writing about the African American community in the 30s, but again, not necessarily naming them.
Right.
So.
Well, you had various people that came here. University of Oregon attracted, of course, students and student athletes all the way back to 1928.
Yes.
We're going back to the time when we had football players here, track athletes such as Mac Robinson, brother of Jackie Robinson, right, who went to school here at University of Oregon. And Mac tried to get his brother Jackie to come here, but the university did not want to recruit him. So
the University of Oregon refused Jackie
Robinson. That's why he went to UCLA.
Ah, okay.
He was in Pasadena City College and a star athlete down there, but for whatever reasons, he was not recruited to the University of Oregon despite the efforts of his brother Mac. And we had African Americans through, as you know, the 1940s and 50s that went to school at the University of Oregon, but were not allowed to live on campus.
Yes.
And not allowed to live in dorms.
Yes.
And so, there's been that double edge of a liberal image that this community has projected.
Since the 60s.
Well, even before that. I mean, you know, it was liberal to have, it was very liberal, extremely liberal, to have an African American on a major college football team in 1929.
Okay. Granted, that's true. Yes.
You know, and when they were excluded from being, you know, members of athletic teams in the South and most of the Northeast and everywhere else. So again, those were revolutionary concepts, you know, in their time, okay? So some people would view, you know, Eugene and Oregon as being out of the box and forward thinking because of the presence of one or two Negroes.
Yes.
Okay, on the university campus playing intercollegiate athletics.
But I guess the team or the college was not necessarily into refusing to play at a place because a place would not allow blacks to come there.
Of course not. Of course not.
So forward thinking to a point.
To a point, yes. So again, you know, we have to look at, you know, the strange, peculiar paradise that Oregon, you know, presents itself in terms of African Americans and people of color in general.
It must be said, you know, because that reference that Greg just made was not an accident. So if you want to Google on the phrase peculiar paradise, you will find a book that's now out of print, but is now available online about the history of blacks in Oregon, called McLaughlin's Peculiar Paradise. Now, mostly it's a Portland and occasionally Salem conversation, but be that as it may, it does give you a picture of what was going on also in Eugene, and some of us are trying to fill in the blanks, you know, in terms of that historical piece as well.
Well, there are blanks throughout the state. For instance, if you look at Klamath Falls, 1947, Klamath Falls founded the second NAACP in the state.
47?
1947. African Americans were in significant numbers in Klamath Falls because that was a stop-off point for the Southern Pacific Railroad.
All right.
And if you remember, Glenn Moore, who was a star basketball player who still lives here in Eugene, star in the late 50s and early 60s at the University of Oregon, came from K Falls and was a product of that community.
Okay. That's where Glenn came from.
That's exactly where he came from.
All right.
So, you know, black Eugenians have come here and resided here from a various different communities and perspectives, and have come from other parts of Oregon that, in fact, to populate this community.
Yes. So, how do you think cultural competence comes into play in your daily awareness and other work, both in the black community, because there is a competency issue in the black community, and also the community at large?
As you know, Mark, the cultural competency burden always falls back on us. Those people who are employed by institutions to either clean up the messes that have occurred in a racial context or to be as preventative measures against those things happening to these institutions. We are, for lack of a better term, you know, a Roman shield for the kind of insurgency that is possible in terms of affecting an institutional community or a corporate community in this particular setting. So at various times we are continually engaged over and over again with students, with faculty, with members of the community who have issues with the institution that are not addressed because the institution is not built or conditioned to respond to these issues. And these issues very often have to do with the nature of individuals being from a different racial group. Now, it always happens, I know, with African Americans. My colleagues can talk about it in the Multicultural Center from the Native perspective, from the Latino perspective, and also from the Asian perspective, But at all times, we are prepared for all kinds of situations which, cultural competency is necessary in a variety of categories. Not only do we have to be competent within our own community, but we have to be competent to be able to navigate and negotiate the greater Lane community and the white community in order to be able to facilitate a positive outcome for those individuals who seek our counsel or help.
As an example, because we will, of course, not name the individual that we've been dealing with even today, but taken as a microcosm. When we deal with the issue of cultural competency, there is no real reciprocity. For example, as people of color in largely white institutions, we are not allowed to be culturally incompetent with those institutions or with the larger white culture. We're not allowed to be culturally incompetent.
We're not.
And remain employed.
And understand this, there have been African Americans and other people of color who have come to this community who were culturally incompetent, who left this community quickly.
Yes.
And it is because they were unable to deal with the issues and people that they were assigned to address.
Right. So, to some degree, okay, in order to remain employed, you have to be culturally competent, at least with that larger institution. Unfortunately, there's no reciprocity with that cultural competency piece, because then when we advocate in terms of saying, all right, so we can deal competently with white students and the white community, why can't our white colleagues deal with mainstream Black America on its terms? So, for example, one of the things that we were dealing with, that we continually deal with, that I've been dealing with in terms of being a counselor and dealing with whether it's mixed-race children or, children of color. I mean, as an alcohol and drug counselor, going back even into the mid-'80s in terms of the juvenile justice system. All right? So the sole Black kid in the class goes out with the popular kids, okay, is expected to be streetwise, is expected to be the drug connection, and is often used as the enforcer, by white kids to say, okay, I need you to go beat up on this kid, and the kid goes and does it. Or, take that, remove that, and say, let's say a group of kids in a car, goes out and smokes weed on the butte or something like that. The white kids will get an MIP or, use of controlled substance and get rehab. The Black kid will get jail. Now, having done cultural competency studies of the juvenile justice system in this county and in the state, one of the things that, our African American colleagues have pointed out in terms of dealing with Black kids in the system is that once they get into that system, it's a free fall into the adult system with no breaks at all. So that by their own statistics, for example, in the 90s when I was first involved with that particular institution, where you had, they showed me a computer printout where a white kid got a referral to alcohol and drug treatment after the second MIP, a Black girl with 6 drug-related never got treatment and basically continued to offend and basically get into the adult system in that case. So one of the things that we look at in terms of looking at, differential treatment is
Mark, that's why the prison population in this country is 43% African American, and
in this state, when we talk about the phenomenon of disproportionate minority confinement, right?
Also 4-to-1 in this state as well. And so when we talk about disproportionality, we are talking about a national trend that is reflected on the local level. Why is it that you have, the African Americans are represented 4 times their per capita rate in the population in these institutions as opposed to other groups? And there's some very basic reasons for that. that you pointed out. You know, the kid doesn't get treatment where the white kid does. You know, there's certain breaks.
Even if he does get into treatment, he doesn't complete, because if he raises issues of race, as he's supposed to, because if he gets, I mean, you're supposed to raise whatever emotional issues affect you, so in treatment, and if you do raise those issues, 12-step based treatment will kick you out. So there's another piece as well where you're dealing with, I'm not going to, you know, point a finger or name the specific juvenile justice officer, but he is still employed, who basically told me in a room full of his colleagues that he didn't understand what this emphasis was on cultural competency. All he had to do was get a suntan, and he would understand black culture better than black kids. That's a quote.
Does not surprise me.
And, you know,
one of the Portland mayors said the same thing.
The Portland mayor said the same thing, you know, and this is 6 months after the Portland mayor had gotten in trouble for saying that. And at the same time, they basically said that their belief was that the ethnic culture and the criminal culture were synonymous and one and the same, and that there was no possibility of redemption. Okay, so they were saying this in the early 90s. So that was their view about kids of color.
Well, you know,
that there was no redemption possible because their ethnicity was their criminality.
But Mark,
they were equated.
This is part of the Willie Lynch
and these people are still working for our system now.
But see, Mark, this is part of the Willie Lynch script that goes back to 1712, in which, you know, African Americans or African people are clearly defined in Western, white, Eurocentric terms, in which white people are clearly superior to those people of color, and those definitions are real clear, and the lines of demarcation are clear. We are inferior, we are subhuman, and we are continued to be viewed that way. Whether, you know, white people will admit that publicly or not, there are still a large cadre of the population who believe on both sides of the line in this whole concept of inferiority.
The color line, yes. Yeah.
The color line.
Right.
So you have whites who believe it, and you have blacks who subconsciously believe it.
Yeah.
And so there are, you know, overt and covert expressions of this kind of racial dilemma throughout the country. See, what people don't understand about race is that you cannot cure 450 years of institutional, cultural, and societal racism in the span of 40 or 50 years. It doesn't work that way. Just because you changed the law in 1964 and 65 with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act that is finally enforced to some degree,
right.
That society doesn't necessarily catch up overnight. Yeah. And so this is a problem that will continue to take generations to solve as we hopefully come closer together in understanding each other and understanding our cultures, our cultural differences, and our cultural similarities. And so cultural competency is about learning about each other and then being able to use that information to better inform conversation and to make mutual progress together. We cannot make mutual progress unless all of us are culturally competent to some degree. That means that we have to know something about everybody's history. We need to know something about everybody's cultural issues, quirks, you know, all the things that go along with that, and have a level of respect for the way that people deal with each other and how they conduct business within the construct of what we have now is called Western civilization.
Yes.
So, you know, we all respond to the American way in different ways based on what our historical, cultural, and familiar experiences have been. So your mother and father formed your framework for understanding America, just like my parents did for me, and my family and my extended family has done for me as well, as we do for our children as well. So there are certain protections that are built in against racism automatically from the time
and
that we are
for
born.
excellence. Yeah.
And for excellence, okay?
Yeah.
So, my mother was a teacher, so I was always pushed towards excellence. My father was a postal worker who always wanted to be an attorney, but had those financial and racial barriers that prevented him from becoming an attorney. So he had an issue for excellence. So, our community has been about striving for excellence, striving for achievement, despite the quotations and protestations of people like James J. Kilpatrick and Bill O'Reilly and Rush Limbaugh and all the rest of them. I'm not running around with a bone in my nose, okay? And I'm not, I'm not inarticulate, okay?
So final thoughts.
Okay. So, in this community, when we talk about race, when we talk about culture in Eugene, there is a definitive lack of respect for African Americans, even in those communities that call themselves allies to us. So when people say that this person is your enemy, this community is your enemy, I don't always find that to be true. I find that on a very clear level that we make allegiances and alliances based on individual contact and relationships, and we have to continue to do that in order to build a firm foundation for racial understanding and progress.
We'll have to leave it there. If you like what you've seen, email us at liveclass@lanecc.edu. We'd like to hear from your feedback. Stay tuned next week for Latino Perspective. This has been DiversiTV. Thanks for tuning in. And thanks, Greg.
Thank you, Mark.